Mackenzie Shirilla didn't just post online. She performed. For some people, social media is a diary. For others, it's a highlight reel. But for Mackenzie, at least the version of her that friends and followers saw, it was a stage. The outfit wasn't the moment. The post was. The party wasn't the memory. The proof was. And if you're the kind of person who needs an audience to feel real, what happens when your real life threatens the image? Because on the morning of July 31st, 2022, 3 teenagers left a get-together and got into a car in Strongsville, Ohio. Less than 2 hours later, police body cameras captured something no family should ever have to imagine: a wrecked vehicle, 3 occupants, and the realization that 2 young men were already gone. 1 person survived. And that survivor is the only one who could tell the story, until the evidence started telling its own. So this is not just a story about a crash. It's a story about a relationship that was reportedly coming apart, a route that didn't lead home, a turn that looked deliberate, and the question that split a community in two: was it an accident, or was it a choice? If a driver is truly out of control, why does the timeline show control first? Before we talk about motive, or court, or internet theories, we talk about the people who never got to defend themselves. Dominic Russo was 20 years old, a young man with a future that still felt open: music interests, plans, and the kind of energy you only have when you believe time is on your side. And Davion Flanagan was 19, a friend, a brother, someone his family described as deeply important, someone who mattered in the everyday way that doesn't make headlines until it's too late. It's easy for true crime stories to pull focus toward the most infamous name. But if we do that too early, we accidentally repeat the harm. We turn victims into background scenery. So let's say it clearly: Dominic was not the boyfriend in the passenger seat. Davion was not the friend in the back. They were 2 human beings who were loved loudly and then lost suddenly. And that loss didn't happen in a distant city or in some shadowy alley. It happened in a normal place, after a normal night, during a normal season of life. That's part of what makes this story so disturbing. Because if this could happen on a quiet road near an industrial park at sunrise, then what exactly stops it from happening again? And that's why families pushed for answers. Because grief without truth is a cage. The crash itself was shocking, but the behavior before the crash is what turned shock into suspicion. Let's talk about Mackenzie, but we're going to do it responsibly. Being online a lot doesn't make someone violent. Being vain doesn't make someone a killer. And being young doesn't mean someone can't be dangerous. So we're not going to diagnose her from a distance. We're going to track themes that show up again and again in what was later described in testimony and reporting. And the biggest theme is this: control. Control over how she looked. Control over how she was seen. Control over the story people told about her. According to accounts, she cared deeply about status, about presenting a certain kind of life, a certain kind of relationship, a certain kind of perfect. And Dominic fit into that picture. They'd been together for years, according to reporting, long enough that people around them saw them as a unit. But together isn't always peaceful. Some relationships don't end in one big explosion. They end in a slow grind, arguing, breaking up, reconnecting, repeating, until someone decides they're done. And in relationships where control is the hidden engine, "I'm done" can be the most dangerous sentence in the world. Because for a controlling partner, a breakup isn't just rejection, it's humiliation. It's losing the role you were playing, losing the script, losing the audience. And that's when the goal shifts. It's no longer "love me." It becomes "you don't get to leave." If the relationship was slipping, the question becomes, what would Mackenzie do to stop that slip? Now we get into the part that has to be clearly labeled. Some of the most alarming details in this case come from accounts described publicly, including recordings and witness statements referenced in coverage. So I'm going to phrase this the right way. According to testimony and reporting, There were incidents where Mackenzie allegedly threatened Dominic, and where the dynamic between them escalated beyond typical teenage drama. There's a difference between a messy relationship and coercive control. Messy is yelling, crying, blocking, unblocking. Control is intimidation, monitoring, forcing proximity, threats when someone tries to step away. And one of the most chilling allegations in this case is that vehicles were part of that control. According to accounts described publicly, Dominic was afraid during at least one prior incident while riding with Mackenzie, fearful enough that he reached out to family for help, believing she might crash the car on purpose. If that's true, it matters because it reframes what the vehicle represents. In most stories, the car is how you escape. In this story, the car may have been used as a way to trap someone. And that's the moment you should pause and ask, if someone has already used driving as a threat, what happens when they're behind the wheel again, at dawn, with no one around? Because once you understand that possibility, the next timeline detail stops sounding casual. It starts sounding like a hinge. According to witness accounts, around 5:15 a.m., after a night of moving between friends' places, Mackenzie insisted on driving. That's not just seat switching. That's control. Because the driver chooses the route. The driver chooses the speed. The driver chooses what home even means. And then Davion asked for a ride. Accounts suggest there was hesitation, an argument. Then Dominic intervened. And Davion got in. 3 people, 1 car, 1 driver. If you're truly just giving someone a ride home, why do you steer toward a street that doesn't go anywhere? When people talk about the last moments, they usually imagine a dramatic goodbye. But most of the time, the last moment is ordinary. A door closes, a seatbelt clicks, someone checks their phone, someone says, "Let's go." According to witness timelines, it's around 5:15 a.m. when the group leaves. Mackenzie is driving. Dominic is in the front passenger seat. Davion is in the back. And if you could freeze frame that instant, before the engine turns over, it would look like nothing. Just 3 young people leaving a late night. But what happens next is why this story never stayed a traffic tragedy. Because the route matters. If your goal is to drop a friend off and head home, the path is usually predictable. You take the simplest roads. You take the fastest roads. You take the roads that lead somewhere. You don't drift into an industrial area at dawn onto a short road that ends. So the first tension point isn't the crash, it's the direction. Imagine you're in the back seat. You're tired. You're trusting the person driving because what choice do you have? You assume you'll be home soon. Now imagine you notice the car isn't going the way you expected. Do you speak up? Do you stay quiet because you don't want conflict? Do you assume the driver knows a shortcut? And here's the thing about shortcuts. They're only shortcuts when they lead to a destination. This one leads to a dead end. If nobody planned to be there, why does the car end up exactly where there's nowhere to go? Now, I want you to hold 2 possibilities in your mind as we enter the evidence. Possibility 1. This is fatigue, impairment, confusion, an unthinkable mistake. Possibility 2. This is control, someone steering the story toward an ending they've already decided. The next piece of the timeline is where those possibilities collide. Because at 5:34 a.m., a camera captures a choice that looks calm. According to trial coverage, surveillance footage shows the car approaching an intersection in Strongsville around 5:34 a.m. And if you're expecting chaos, swerving, drifting, frantic correction, you don't get it. What's described is the opposite. The car slows. The car positions itself properly. A turn signal flashes, and the vehicle turns onto a road called Progress Drive, a clean turn. Not the kind of turn you make while slumped over unconscious. Not the kind of turn you make while fighting the wheel. A turn that looks like a decision. And that's why this timestamp becomes a hinge in the case. Because if you want to argue medical episode, you now have to explain timing. When did it happen? Before the turn? After the turn? If it happened before, how does a clean turn happen at all? If it happened after, Then we're back at the earlier question. Why go to Progress Drive? And less than a minute later, another camera suggests commitment. According to prosecution arguments reported publicly, a second camera captures the same vehicle about 50 seconds after that calm turn. And the description of this moment is what makes people go quiet, because the car isn't cruising. It isn't even speeding. It's accelerating hard, on a short road that ends. In court, prosecutors argued the speed was around 100 miles per hour, or roughly in that range. And I want you to understand what that implies without turning it into spectacle. 100 miles per hour isn't a mistake you drift into by accident. It's not a speed you hit while casually distracted for a second. It's something you do by staying on the gas, by holding pressure, by choosing not to stop. And here's another detail prosecutors emphasized: braking. In the way the evidence was described publicly, there was no meaningful sign of a last-second attempt to slow down before impact. Again, this isn't a magic detail by itself. Crash evidence can be complicated, but combined with the video sequence, it becomes a question that doesn't go away. Where is the survival reflex? Where is the panic? Because most unintended crashes include a moment of, oh no, a jerk of the wheel, a slam on the brake, a last-second attempt to undo the mistake. So when you hear no real braking, the question sharpens: was there no time, or was there no attempt? And the impact answers one question while creating 10 more. In the aftermath, the defense would later argue an explanation centered on a medical episode, suggesting a sudden loss of consciousness could have caused the crash. And it's a serious claim because it would change how you interpret everything. If a driver truly blacks out, then the turn is coincidence, the acceleration is uncontrolled, and the deaths are a nightmare without intent. But prosecutors pointed back to the footage sequence: controlled driving, then extreme acceleration. And this is where the case becomes less about what anyone says and more about what the timeline shows. Because the cameras don't capture emotion, they capture motion. Then there's toxicology, described in public reporting as including THC and no alcohol. People online often use that like a shortcut. Well, that explains it. But it doesn't explain the calm turn at 534. It doesn't explain the choice of road. It doesn't explain why the car ends up at the end of Progress Drive. And another detail enters public discussion: seatbelts. In some reporting summaries, it's described that Mackenzie was restrained while the two young men were not. Now, this is important. Seatbelt details can be messy and disputed, and they should never be treated like a standalone verdict. But the reason people focus on it is simple. At that speed, being restrained can be the difference between dying and surviving. So when the driver survives and the passengers don't, people can't help but wonder, was survival simply luck, or was it designed? And that question, once it enters a community, doesn't leave quietly. It spreads. It hardens into suspicion. It makes families look backward, searching for signs they missed. And in this case, the people who refused to stop asking questions weren't internet strangers. They were the ones who lost everything. In the weeks after the crash, the story becomes bigger than the road. Because as Mackenzie recovered, public attention grew. And according to public accounts, she remained visible, online, in conversations, in the way people discussed the case. Some saw a traumatized teen. Others saw something colder. But here's the rule we're going to live by. We do not convict people based on how they should grieve. Grief is not a performance. Shock can look like numbness. Trauma can look like detachment. So behavior alone isn't proof. But families and people close to the victims believed there was more to the story. And they kept pushing. And when families push, they sometimes bring something the first investigation didn't have: context, history, patterns, recordings. And once investigators look at a case through the lens of pattern, the next step is almost always the same in modern crime stories. They follow the digital trail. And that's where we're going next, Because phones don't care about spin. They don't care about reputation. They don't care about what sounds true. They only care about what happened. And if this was a random wrong turn, why, according to prosecutors, does the data suggest she already knew that road? When investigators stop treating a crash like a tragedy and start treating it like a case, the questions change. It's no longer, what do we think happened? It becomes what can be proven. And in modern cases, proof often starts in the quietest place imaginable, inside a device that goes everywhere with you. A phone can't feel guilt. It can't feel grief. It can't fake a personality. It only does one thing. It keeps track. According to prosecutors and reporting on what was presented in court, digital evidence suggested Mackenzie's phone had been in the area of Progress Drive before the fatal morning, more than once. Some coverage and commentary have described a specific number of prior visits, but if you hear a number floating around online, treat it carefully unless it's tied to court testimony. What matters is the point prosecutors made. This wasn't her first time near that road, and that single idea, familiarity, changes the entire shape of the story, because a wrong turn is believable when the map shows randomness, but it becomes harder to believe when the map shows a pattern. Here's the gut check question. If that road meant nothing, why does it keep appearing in the digital trail? You don't casually end up at a dead end again and again unless something draws you there. A meetup, a hangout, a shortcut you like, or something darker, a place you've scouted because it gives you control. And this is where the case starts to feel less like a crash and more like a plan. Not because of one dramatic clue, because of a stack of ordinary clues pointing in the same direction. A controlled turn, a sudden acceleration, a dead end, a pattern on a map. And now the next question becomes unavoidable. If prosecutors could argue she knew that road, what were they going to argue she meant to do on it? Because when this case finally becomes public in court, one word keeps showing up underneath everything: intent. In a case like this, prosecutors don't need the world to hate the defendant. They need the evidence to make the story make sense. And the story they built, according to public reporting, was not, she was reckless. It was, she was deliberate. They pointed to the calm driving right before the acceleration. They emphasized the idea that the turn at 5:34 a.m. looked controlled. They focused on the fact that the road ended, and they argued that reaching extreme speed there didn't happen by accident. Because even if someone is emotional, even if someone is furious, even if someone feels rejected, there's still a moment where the body wants to live. That's what braking is. That's what swerving is. That's what panic is. And prosecutors argued the evidence didn't show that. Instead, they argued it showed commitment. And if you're wondering what kind of motive could make someone commit to something like that, remember the theme we planted in the very beginning: control over the narrative, control over the relationship, control over the moment where someone else thinks they can leave. In court, motive isn't always a dramatic confession. Sometimes it's a simple idea. If I can't have you, you don't get to go. Or even colder. If my story is falling apart, I'll decide how it ends. Now, the defense didn't just sit there and accept that, because defense attorneys don't need an alternate story that feels perfect. They need a story that creates doubt. And the defense story, according to reporting, centered around a medical explanation: a sudden loss of consciousness, a health episode that turns a suspicious route into a coincidence, a tragic outcome without intent. So, once the trial begins, the case becomes a tug-of-war between two columns. Column A, accident, impairment, medical event. Column B, intent, pattern, deliberate driving. And every new piece of evidence is treated like it belongs in one column or the other. But the most important decision Mackenzie made in court wasn't about the route. It was about who would judge her. Most people imagine a trial like a movie. A jury, dramatic reactions, a big moment where everyone gasps. But in this case, according to reporting, Mackenzie chose a bench trial. meaning a judge decides the verdict instead of a jury. And that matters because jurors are human. They bring emotion, instinct, bias, empathy, anger, all of it. A judge is also human, but trained to hold the evidence differently. A judge has seen 1,000 attempts to spin a narrative. A judge isn't supposed to be impressed by drama. A judge wants the timeline to hold. So when you choose a bench trial, you're betting on something specific. You're betting that the law, strictly applied, won't see intent. You're betting that the evidence can be explained. You're betting the prosecution's story won't lock in. And that creates a quiet tension. If a judge convicts, it means the evidence wasn't just emotional, it was strong. And when the evidence finally gets weighed, the verdict doesn't arrive as a surprise. It arrives like a door closing. According to public reporting on the case outcome, the court found Mackenzie guilty in August 2023. That verdict is the moment where the accident version loses its grip, at least legally. And if you've never watched a case like this play out, you might assume the verdict is the end. But the verdict is only the label. The sentencing is where the consequences become real. Because sentencing isn't just punishment. Sentencing is the court saying, "This is what we believe you chose." And in cases involving loss of life, sentencing is also where families speak in a way that isn't filtered through headlines. It's where grief becomes language. Now, I'm not going to dramatize victim impact statements. I'm not going to use someone's pain as a hook. But I do want you to understand this. Families don't get to argue about theories. They live with the outcome every day. And for them, the question, accident or choice, isn't a debate topic. It's a wound. And when the sentence is read, the time stops being abstract. It becomes years. The easiest lesson to take from this story is the laziest one. Social media is bad. It's a comfortable lesson because it doesn't ask anything of us except judgment. But it's not the real lesson because people chase attention every day and don't hurt anyone. The deeper lesson sits underneath the attention. It's about control. Control isn't always loud. Sometimes control looks like romance at first. Control looks like, "I just care about you." Control looks like, "Don't leave me." Control looks like intensity that you mistake for devotion. And then over time, control starts demanding proof. Proof that you're loyal. Proof that you're not leaving. Proof that you belong. And if you've ever watched a controlling relationship escalate, you know the pattern. The person who wants control doesn't handle rejection like normal heartbreak. They handle it like humiliation, like an attack on their identity, like the whole world is watching them lose. And if they can't control your feelings, they try to control your movement, your choices, your exits. In this case, according to what prosecutors argued and what the court ultimately concluded, control moved from emotional pressure to something physical, to a car, to a road, to a decision with consequences that can't be edited after. And that's why this story sticks, because it forces you to realize something frightening. Some people don't just want love, they want ownership. And when ownership is threatened, they can become dangerous. So the final question isn't, how did this happen? The final question is, what would have stopped it earlier? I want to end with something practical, because stories like this shouldn't just leave you shaken. They should leave you sharper. If you see patterns like these in a relationship, take them seriously. If someone threatens self-harm or reckless behavior to keep a partner close, if someone uses a vehicle, speed, or danger as a way to scare someone into compliance, if someone treats a breakup like betrayal instead of a boundary, if someone keeps escalating when the other person tries to leave, those aren't dramatic teen moments. Those are warning signs. And the hard part is, warning signs are often visible only in hindsight. People don't want to believe someone they know could do something unthinkable. So they minimize. They explain it away. They tell themselves it's just immaturity, just emotion, just a phase. But phases can kill when control is the engine. If there's one takeaway, it's this. When someone shows you that they're willing to turn danger into leverage, believe them the first time. And now, we close where we began, with the people whose names should never be reduced to a headline.